Hi, my name's Andy,
And I'm Jason.
and this is the Power 2 Pod. This week's episode, we are going to go through all the SEC teams and, pick and choose our biggest concerns for each team. And then we're going to finish the episode off with a Penn State Minute and Georgia Minute. So without further ado, let's jump right in. All right, we're going to start off. We're going to go alphabetical order, so don't think we're favoring any team or anything here, but get started here with Alabama. My biggest concern with Alabama is their secondary is really young. I know they brought in Keon Saab from Michigan, but he's a young guy too. So there's a lot of inexperience on the back end there. And with the new teams coming over with Oklahoma, Texas, and just the evolution of football, the passing defense has become kind of the most important part of the defense anymore. So my biggest concern moving forward with Alabama is going to be their young secondary.
Yeah, I agree for sure. Some of mine were just DeBoer transitioning to the SEC. It's a big change for coaches and their schemes and their personnel. The guys that they bring with them and everything else. SEC football is a lot different than Big Ten football or Pac-12 football, Big 12 football. Like each conference kind of has their own niche, and with the Nick Saban tenure is over, there's just a lot of change. There's a lot of players moving around. They always have players going to the draft. Like I said, the secondary, like they had 2 or 3 guys get drafted out of that secondary. So I think it's just a lot of change, and the Alabama fans are going to have the highest expectations no matter what. So I think for DeBoer, it's going to be tough to live up to those expectations year one with all that change happening at once.
Yeah, Alabama fans are now spoiled with Nick Saban and all the success, so they're going to expect national championship or bust. Moving on, next up we got Arkansas. My biggest concern with Arkansas is going to be is quarterback Taylon Green the answer at quarterback. He's a Boise State transfer, was really successful up there. Looking at Arkansas, it's kind of the Cinderella stories wearing off, where Sam Pittman had a really good first year and hasn't been able to replicate that success. So they've really been looking for that playmaker, difference maker at quarterback, and KJ Jefferson didn't exactly provide that last year. So they're bringing in Taylon Green, and hopefully, for Arkansas' sake, he can live up to expectations and propel this Arkansas team back forward.
Yeah, for sure. And I think another big concern for Arkansas will just be their depth in general. They last year, Sam Pittman usually always has a pretty good above average offensive line, and they just got riddled with injuries. And so I think just depth on both sides of the ball, offensive line, defensive line, they got to be able to get that depth to have that next man up to fill that spot. And I also don't, it's a big concern that Pittman is technically on the hot seat. Like you said, there's some Arkansas fans that don't think that he should have gotten an extra year this year. So if he can't turn it around, become bowl eligible, and compete in the SEC, like you said, his seat is definitely going to be hot.
Yeah, but at the same time, the best career in college football is a fired coach. So if he does get fired, he's living easy with the buyout.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Auburn. My biggest concern for Auburn for this season is going to be the revamped defensive line. They actually have 5 transfers coming in, so they're completely redoing that off defensive line. And in SEC football, it's just like the Big Ten, where the game's won in the trenches, and if you can create havoc on your defensive line and only rush 4, you're going to be a pretty good team. So with all the turnover on the defense line at Auburn, with new guys in, old guys out, you're hoping that he, head coach there found the guys he's looking for to fit his scheme, and hopefully Auburn will be able to stand firm there on the defensive line.
Yeah, for sure. And with Hugh Freeze, I honestly feel it's just a matter of time before that Auburn team is back to relevancy and back to being a top 5-6 team in the SEC every year. I think one of the biggest things that has held him back is his quarterback play. They were able to go get Peyton Thorne from Michigan State last year or 2 years ago even, and he's going to be the starting quarterback this year. There's reports that, he's developing more and more, having a full off season with Hugh Freeze and his quarterback coach, but just his on-field performance is just not to par for the SEC. And so I think that's going to be Auburn's biggest downfall for this year is just going to be their quarterback play. But, if you're an Auburn fan, I think there's a lot of positive to look at for Hugh Freeze, and that Auburn going forward after this year.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds for this season. It sounds like they'll go as far as Peyton Thorne takes them, which is the same for a lot of teams. Next up, we have Florida. Florida's another one of those teams. A lot of roster turnover. Highly, regarded recruiting class coming in. I'm not even going to go really personnel-wise for their biggest concern. Florida got screwed with the schedule. They really did. I think they have 5 top 12 teams on their schedule. So if you're looking at that, I mean, and, Florida's coming off a very disappointing season. To just look at that schedule and that gauntlet, and I think the 5 games are pretty much all in a row. It's brutal, and that's going to be my big concern for Florida this year is how do they survive that gauntlet? Can they get a couple games out of that? Or if they go 0-5 through that, that's going to be really hard to come back from because you're going to get beat up from those games. So my biggest concern from Florida for this season is going to be their schedule.
Yeah, I think so too. Like you said, it's just bad luck getting so many hard games right in a row. But another thing is, Napier's another one that probably has the hottest seat in football with Florida as being as big a brand as they are in the SEC, and he has definitely not lived up to his reputation or what Florida was thinking they were going to get out of his head coach. But another thing is I can easily see, what's his name, Graham Mertz. He's projected to be the starting quarterback opening day, but I would not be surprised once, like you said, they go through that gauntlet that you start seeing more of DJ come in, and that's kind of Napier's diamond in the rough that he's able to recruit. So I see him, switching quarterback kind of mid-season and trying to use that as a secure for his job. Like, hey, look what we're looking at forward for next year. If DJ's able to play well, but there's not a lot of positive outlooks for Florida this year with that schedule.
Yeah. Looks like he's just gonna hitch his wagon to DJ Lagway, and hopefully he can, ball out and make Florida relevant again. Next up, we got Georgia. My biggest concern for Georgia this year. It's hard to find a concern for Georgia because they're such a good team. So it's really hard to pick, what's concerning you about Georgia this year. If you look at last year, the rush defense wasn't very good last year, and it didn't get super exposed until that Alabama game, really. But all it takes is one game for that rush defense to get exposed, and you lose. If you lose, first round or second round of the college football playoffs, you're out again. So I don't know how much Georgia really brought in, if they brought in enough, or they're just going to elevate and hope to play better scheme-wise. And, with the turnover of players, just hopefully they play a little bit better on the rush defense side of things. But that's going to be my big concern if I have to pick one for Georgia, is going to be their rush defense.
Yeah, for sure. And, that's kind of the unfortunate, I guess, the unfortunate circumstances of being a good team consecutive years in a row is that you just lose so many people in the draft and everything else and transfer outs. It's hard, and I think that's caught up with Georgia. When they won back-to-back national championships, they had so many players go to the draft. They lost so many players in the portal. So it was a rebuild on that defensive line. And that's supposed to be Kirby's kind of profession. His specialty is defense and defensive line and stuff like that. So, but yeah, for me, it's red zone defense. Georgia was, I think, ranked like 116th or something like that in red zone defense last year. And that, like I said, Georgia being a defensive, school, that definitely has to improve going into this year. And I think it makes a difference when, you can stop your opponents to 3 points versus 7, especially in the red zone and stuff like that. Like, that wins games at the end. And then they have a couple tough road games that they got to go play. They got to go to Alabama and they got to go to Ole Miss this year.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I think anybody in the SEC besides, I think Ole Miss has kind of the easier schedule where they get their big games at home. Everybody's going to have those hard road games in the SEC this year. But I mean, with Georgia, I mean, the trust is there with Kirby that he's going to fix things and get things right. So, they're concerns, but are they big concerns? We'll see. Next up, we have Kentucky. For Kentucky's biggest concern, I'm going with their quarterback battle. They brought in Brock Vandagriff and Gavin Wimsatt, both transfers. Brock Vandagriff came from Georgia, I believe. And then Gavin Wimsatt is from Rutgers. So Gavin Wimsatt, I mean, I've seen a few games of his. I mean, he showed flashes, but, he's playing out-talented, basically, against some of the better teams in the Big Ten, so it's really hard to gauge. Anytime you have a quarterback battle, if you don't have one guy, or if you have two guys, you don't have one guy. So it's going to be really interesting to see who Stoops picks to be his quarterback, and if they can produce like Will Levis did and kind of have a really good season at Kentucky.
Yeah, for sure. Kentucky's another one that they have a pretty hard schedule. They have a lot of tough road games. They even have tough home games. But what's interesting that I've seen is, Kentucky's one of those teams that, if they're going to win, especially in the SEC, in their conference games, they're going to win close games. It's going to be a one-score game most of the time. They're not the team to just be able to run over a Florida or Alabama. It's going to be a one-score team. And I was seeing that their special teams, especially punting, was like one of the worst in the FBS, not even in like Power 5, but the FBS. Like, they only average like 38 yards a punt or something like that. And then they were one of the most penalized teams too. So it's just the sloppy play and so that. And like I said, when you're a school that is just, like I said, more than likely your tough games are, one score. Those special teams and those penalties matter, and I think that's just something that Stoops really has to, put his foot down and clean up that sloppy play.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going against teams that are more talented than you kind of got to win in the margins, and penalties and special teams are definitely winning in the margins. Next up, we have LSU. My biggest concern for LSU is going to be their wide receiver depth. They lost their top 3 receivers to the NFL draft. So, complete rebuild there. Enter a new quarterback as well. So, you're going to have a lot of new faces and new places type thing where is the chemistry going to be there right off the get-go, and can the wide receivers make the same impact as they did last year?
Yeah, but LSU is one of those schools that can definitely reload at those positions. They were putting wide receivers and quarterbacks in the NFL every year, and so I think they'll be able to reload, and I feel like their quarterback is ready to go. It's his time, it's his team. He stayed behind Jaden. So I think definitely this offseason he'll be able to develop a lot better. But for my biggest concerns is LSU's defense. Last year they were ranked like total defense was above 100. They let in so many big plays, and that probably kept them out of like championship contention. Was their defense just being so bad? And having a blank here of the coach's name.
Kelly.
Yeah, Brian Kelly.
Yeah.
He basically brought in an entire new defensive staff, new coordinator, new position coaches, and everything. Um, but the talent really hasn't changed. He didn't bring in a whole lot of transfers and recruits for that defensive side of the ball, so I don't see them really improving on the defensive side. So I think that's going to be their biggest struggle or concern going into this year.
Yeah, I mean, you had the Heisman winner, Jaden Daniels, there last year, and he really didn't even sniff the playoffs, let alone the SEC championship. So a lot going on at LSU. Next up, we have Mississippi State. Looking at Mississippi State, new coach coming in and all that, but I'm looking at their past defense. They literally lost their entire secondary on a secondary that wasn't all that great last year. So they're going to be completely retooling that with a new system, new scheme, new coaches. So a lot of happening on the back end of that defense. And if I'm pointing to one big concern with Mississippi State, I'm pointing to their past defense.
Yeah, and Mississippi State's kind of been known for their defense, and for them to be struggling in their past defense is definitely a concern. Mine is kind of simple, just all new coaching staff, and then you're bringing a transfer quarterback on top of that, who doesn't know your scheme. You're bringing in a whole new scheme for the people that are returning. It's just usually not a recipe for instant success. So that's just a big concern, is just, gathering all the new schemes together and trying to get it to mesh. And it's just questionable how Blake Shapen will be able to lead that team and lead that offense, learning that offensive scheme.
Yeah, and with with Mississippi State, they kind of live in the middle of the SEC, so not if they can make a bowl game with Jeff Levy's first season, I think that'd be a success, and then start building from there. Put down a good base this year and really come out next year building that program up. Up next, we have Missouri, who had a very successful year last year. My biggest concern with them is going to be the rushing offense. They lost pretty much every running back last year. They brought in 2 transfers, Marcus Carroll and Nate Knoll, who are going to have to carry the load on that side or not that side of the ball, but that aspect of offense. So that's my biggest concern. I mean, they're returning a lot with, Brady Cook's back. You're bringing back a lot of the pass catchers. So my concern with them is going to be the rushing attack.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it was overlooked last year that their offense was ran through the run, that it set up the passing for Brady Cook. One of my thing is just replacing all the lost talent on the defensive side. They had a handful of guys get drafted. I think they had the most draft picks since like 2006 or something like that for that Missouri team. But their head coach, Eli Dershowitz, I think is what his name is.
Yeah, Drinkwitz.
I think he's one of the most underrated coaches in the SEC. I know people are kind of projecting them to have like more of a down year than they did last year, but I don't know. I think he's a good enough coach to be able to reload and stay competitive and stay on the top half of the SEC.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if Missouri has the ability to reload instead of rebuild. So can you build on your successes and keep coming back year to year and not have one good year and then have to rebuild for a couple years, one good year? So I think they have the right guy in place, and as long as he keeps building, I think they'll be fine. Next up, we have SEC newcomer Oklahoma, and my biggest concern is quarterback Jackson Arnold. I know he got some run last year. I'm just not a big Jackson Arnold guy from what I've seen last year. And, kind of turnover prone. I know he's got a big arm, but you're losing Jeff Levy, the offense coordinator. You're coming into the SEC, which a lot harder defenses than the Big 12. It's not, we're not here to, say that the defenses are anywhere close on that level. The SEC has better defenses every week than the Big 12. And you're looking at Jackson Arnold, who, like I said, was turnover prone. And I really hope he can be the guy there for Oklahoma fans, but he concerns me.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to piggyback off of that. Like I said, they lost, the loss of Jeff Levy's huge. He was a huge, part of that offense. And I just think their offense is just going to struggle overall without Levy. And with Venables being the coach there, he's always ran a good defense, at least a competitiveness enough defense to keep you in games. So it really relies on the offensive coordinator and, like you said, Jackson Arnold's ability to go out there and win games, and help their defense out.
Yeah, I think, Oklahoma's in a transitional period where they're moving into a new conference, and it's a completely new ball game than what they were facing week in and week out in the Big 12. There's no off weeks on the SEC schedule, essentially. Next up, we have Ole Miss, and my biggest concern has nothing to do with the players. My only concern is Lane Kiffin being conservative in the big games. He's yet to beat Alabama or Georgia. I know that's a big task. I mean, my coach is James Franklin. We haven't beat Michigan or Ohio State in a long time. So I understand, but like I said, my biggest concern, can Lane Kiffin be Lane Kiffin in these big games? There's a reason why Ole Miss is good, and that's because Lane Kiffin is being aggressive and making the right calls. And last year especially, he kind of shriveled up and got really conservative against Alabama and Georgia, and that ultimately cost them the chance at the SEC and making the college football playoff for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. And and that was kind of my note on Ole Miss was you really, you look at their roster and you can't really find that big a weakness, like a big red flag. It's just them getting over the hump, winning the big games that they have to win, and especially this year when the schedule's favorable. They think they have the second or first easiest schedule in the SEC. All your big games are at home. So, like, Lane Kiffin just has to get over that hump of beating the big games, being able to win those big games. But like I said, Lane Kiffin is like a player's coach, so you're gonna see him more and more attack that transfer portal for the roster gaps that he does have, and he'll have a lot of good teams going forward. But like you said, he has to win those big games, and it really doesn't have to do with the players on the field.
Yeah, it all comes down to, can you be the best version of yourself against the best teams and not completely change what you do when you go against the big dogs. Next up, we have South Carolina. Looking at their team, they're it's going to be kind of a quarterback switch with Norris Sellers coming in for his sophomore season. I'm a big fan of his. I mean, he's super explosive, very dynamic quarterback there. So my concern with South Carolina is going to be at the running back, because you don't want Sellers running the ball all that much in the SEC. I mean, it's going to be too much of a beating. So you really got to have a running attack to help him out and make the game easy for him as well. And if you look at South Carolina's roster, there's not a proven guy on their roster right now at the running back position.
Yeah, and it's almost across the board on the offensive side. Like you said, Sellers he's their best player on offense for sure. But you've got to have those weapons downfield. Like you said, being able to balance the run with the pass. And they just have a lack of offensive skill players to where it's a big concern for South Carolina going into this year.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the biggest playmaker they have is Nick Harbor, who, I mean, 5-star guy. He guy's a monster. He's the biggest player on the field. I believe they're gonna tight end wide receiver him. So it's gonna be cool to see him and Sellers hook up. But that's pretty much their biggest playmaker is Harbor's. So it's gonna be, like I said, it'll be fun when those two hook up, because Harbor is just such an animal. Next up on the list here, we have Tennessee. My biggest concern with Tennessee is going to be the secondary. Just kind of with like Alabama, Tennessee secondary, they had a ton of movement. They had three players in the secondary drafted, and they also had 7 DBs transfer out. So we're talking about a completely new room there in the secondary, and that's going to be a big obstacle in the now SEC, where you're seeing the ball fly around.
Yeah, And that was big. The big Josh Heupel's biggest red flag was to get his defense into an SEC average defense, because his offense is always going to be high powered, no matter what. And so seeing all those DBs go, like you said, it's just a complete rebuild. So you're not going to have any chemistry or any returning players in that secondary. It's definitely going to be a huge concern for Josh Heupel's defense.
But at least I got James Pierce Jr. coming back on edge. That guy is crazy. So, I mean, that might help out the secondary a little bit with him rushing the passer. But, I mean, that's a lot of changeover in the back end of that defense. Next up here, we have Texas. For Texas, my biggest concern is going to be wide receiver chemistry with, they lost their top 4 skill players to the draft, 3 wide receivers, tight end. They lost all those to the draft, not transfer portal or anything. I know they brought in Isaiah Bond from Alabama, and they brought in another wide receiver. But, it's a lot of moving parts, and, you're looking for that chemistry. Is this guy going to be where I need him to be for Quinn Ewers to be successful? I mean, he has to trust his receivers. And, I mean, Texas is another one of those teams where you can almost put them up with Georgia, where they're not going to have many roster concerns. But one I can point to, if I'm nitpicking, is kind of the wide receiver chemistry with, the top guys getting drafted and having to bring new guys in.
Yeah, for sure. And they had a handful of guys on just the offensive side of the ball get drafted. So you just got to reload. But yeah, looking at the roster again, it's hard to find a weakness in that Texas team. But again, just another concern is Texas. They made the playoffs last year, and kind of getting back to relevancy, contention, anyways. But it'll be interesting to see how their defense holds up, playing SEC teams every single week, coming from the Big 12. And it's just a huge change. It's just, like I said, it's just a different type, different style of football. So I think defense is probably their biggest concern. But, like I said, I'm not surprised if they make the SEC championship game. So it's hard to find huge concerns for that Texas team.
Yeah, I mean, you always hear, the SEC's bigger, faster, stronger. So, Texas may have looked big, fast, and strong against the Big 12. And, I mean, if you look at the roster, they should hold up fine against the SEC, but you just don't know that until you're playing, 8 SEC games a year. Next up, we have Texas A&M. Texas A&M, bringing in a new coach in from Duke there. And you're looking at what could be a possible big concern there. And I'm going to go with a rebuilt offensive line. If you're looking, they're maybe bringing back one starter from last year. I mean, it's a good problem to have because they brought so many people in. It's more like opened up the competition. So it's not more so like they lost a bunch of guys, but they brought in more guys to shore up that offensive line. But with a rebuild offensive line, you got to have, like we said, chemistry is a big thing in college football. You got to have the chemistry, you got to have the trust, and you also have to, be in the right scheme and, play. You have to play the way the coach wants you to and make the plays there. So I'm going with the rebuilt offensive line for Texas A&M.
Yeah, and Texas A&M, it was just surprising how everything unfolded with them signing Jimbo to such a large contract and cutting it short. And now they're back to rebuilding everything from the ground up with a whole new staff, new players. They had a heck of a recruiting class a couple years ago. The NIL money there is strong. They can get good recruits and stuff like that, but just the player turmoil, coaches turmoil, like you said, there's no chemistry to that team. So that's just a huge concern on both sides of the ball. And now you're bringing a new coach, new scheme. Some of those recruits, didn't commit to that coach, and it will just be interesting to see how that plays out this year.
Yeah, Mike Elko's a good coach, so I'm sure he'll figure it out. I just don't know if he'll have enough time to figure it out this season. I mean, obviously his first year there, so there's no hot seat issues or anything, but I think he'll figure it out in time. But there's going to be concerning things for every team. Last but not least, we round out the SEC biggest concerns with Vanderbilt. My biggest concern for Vanderbilt is their quarterback battle. They brought in Pavia from, I forget the school now, New Mexico State, who beat Auburn last year. He was the leading passer on that team to upset Auburn at Auburn. And then they also have Johnson, who transferred over from Utah. So, here we go again, quarterback battle. If you have a true quarterback battle, that doesn't always work out great because, one bad game, do I go back to the other guy? Do I go back to this guy? And, you can point out a lot of concerns with Vanderbilt just because they're the least talented team in the SEC. But my biggest concern is going to be the most important position, which is quarterback.
Yeah, for sure. And, if I was to put my money on it, I think Pavia will win that battle. I think he's just more versatile for that Vanderbilt team. Unfortunately, Vanderbilt, being in the SEC, they get thrown in the gauntlet every year. And with that being said, and we've touched on this before, all their best players get transferred out. I know Georgia took one of their best wide receivers this last year. And, like I said, they just get picked and prodded every single year. So it's like almost a rebuild year every year for them because their best players that showcase their talent in the SEC teams go and get that guy to fill their needs and stuff like that. So it's just a very hard for Vanderbilt to get a step ahead.
Yeah, for sure. I would put them in the same categories like Rutgers, but Rutgers is, I believe, far better than Vanderbilt at this point. But Rutgers struggles with the same type of things. But yeah, it's a hard life for Vanderbilt in the SEC. With that said, that'll conclude our SEC biggest concerns. Now let's move on to the Penn State Minute. For the Penn State Minute, kind of want to touch on some recruiting stuff. Penn State is really struggling this cycle in the state of Pennsylvania. Currently, there's only one of the top 10 recruits are committed to Penn State, and that's linebacker Alex Tatch. They lost the top quarterback in the state, Zollers, to Missouri. They lost the top offensive tackle, Carroll, to Alabama. The top edge rusher, Mathis, to Ohio State. They're still really struggling in Philadelphia. There's hope that they can land tight end Alex Olish. But for whatever reason, we've kind of locked down the state per se the last couple of years. But for whatever reason this season, it seems that Penn State's really struggling to recruit in Pennsylvania, in their home state, which could be concerning moving forward. Or it could just be one of those cycles where, you just don't have it in the state and hopefully you rebound next year. Touching on a couple other things, James Franklin had a press conference today, and he touched on Drew Shelton, who we haven't seen, the offensive tackle. We didn't see him all spring. I'm just going to read the quote here from Franklin. I think he's fully cleared now. He was still pretty much doing everything, but he had a few limitations, like in the weight room, but I think he's fully cleared now, and I think he's in really good position. This is super important because Shelton is probably replacing Olu on the offensive line. So, protecting Aller's blind side is probably the most important position on the Penn State offensive line. And it's good to hear that Drew Shelton, who's looked very promising, is now healthy and can continue the rest of the offseason fully healthy, full participant, and develop and protect Drew Aller. The other thing is, usually by now, we have who the team captains are going to be for Penn State. James Franklin hasn't named any captains this year, and he actually had a quote in his press conference today concerning the issue. He said, we had a vote a couple weeks ago. A lot of times we do that vote right before the summer starts because we like to go in the summer with some of that leadership. So they usually pick 3 guys and, one offense, one defense, one special teams. And through summer, those 3 players lead the team essentially because Penn State, James Franklin, he wants the team to be a player-led team, and he wants the players to hold each other accountable. And if they do that, that's when Penn State's had the really successful years, is when the players are owning the leadership role. He would go on to say that we like to go in the summer with some sort of that leadership, but we only make that decision if there's clear and obvious guys in the vote. So, like I said, they had their vote, and there wasn't a guy that stuck out. Now it's looking like Nick Dawkins could be the offensive guy, the offensive lineman there. He really been sticking out vocally from a leadership standpoint, but might not just be there yet until after summer. But he's looking at as one of the players, and so is Devon Ellis. He's looking like one of the vocal leaders on the defense. So it'll be really interesting to see fall camp and before who's going to take on that leadership role and who the team believes in to take that leadership role. And that'll conclude my Penn State Minute.
Yeah, so moving to the Georgia Minute. Georgia comes into 2024 with a number 2 ranked running back room. We got the Florida transfer ETN coming in, and then we have Branson Robinson, who will most likely to split time with ETN. You know, he missed all of last year with a season-ending injury before the season even started. And then they even have Roderick Robinson as their third running back, who will most likely still see some time, even, behind those two. So it's always exciting. Georgia normally has really good running backs, and that's basis off of usually having a top 3 offensive line in college football. So it's always exciting to see. I think we're behind Ohio State, and I think they're ranked number 1 in the running back room. Moving on to Brent Key. He is the head coach for Georgia Tech. He's been trying to kind of renew the rivalry of Georgia and Georgia Tech hatred. He quoted, "There's not much more I hate more." And he kind of backtracked and he's like, except for Georgia, like, I hate everything about Georgia. And he's just trying to get it into the media to try to like renew that rivalry and make it, just more competitive. And it's just good. It's good for the sport. In-state rivalries are always interesting and can make some of the best games. But the last time Georgia Tech has beat Georgia was in 2016. So, one of his goals always is to try to beat Georgia. And then with some recruitment news, some recent commits, we committed defensive lineman Christian Garrett and a wide receiver Talon Taylor. And I think both of those are 4 stars. So they're trying to, hopefully that kind of kickstarts the 2025 recruiting class. I think we're currently ranked like 7th or 8th. So hopefully, getting some more guys here and there will kind of keep moving up the rankings there.
All right, that'll do it for this episode of Power 2 Pod. Once again, my name is Andy, and that's Jason. Look going forward, we have our off-season series starting. We should launch those, I believe, Saturday the 15th and Sunday the 16th should be our first 2. So look out for those going forward. We're going to do just quick little breakdowns on every team in the Big Ten and SEC, just to get more content out to you guys and hopefully build a following here. With that being said, like, subscribe, review. Thanks for joining us, and have a good day.
Yeah, see you.